am one of the two. All right, we're recording. My name is Alice Morrison. I'm one of the two co-executive directors of Friends of Family Farmers. And we are an organization that is by and for small and mid-sized, highly diversified local market farmers across the state. We represent about 1,600 farmers across Oregon, all of whom have at least one direct-to-consumer sales outlet. So you're thinking like farm stand, CSA, farmers market, that kind of folk who are growing highly diversified crops and often who have a livestock component or focus to their business. We run three main programs, and we'll put these links in the chat as well in case you're coming to us from elsewhere and want more information about what we do. We run the Oregon Farm Link program, which is a land access program to help land seekers and land holders find the land that will help make their farm plans a reality and find land security to make that sounds, so we don't have those on the recording. But that program, in addition to having the FarmLink site where you can make a listing as a farm holder or a farm seeker to find either your own farmland or the next steward of your land. We also have a one-on-one technical assistance program through Oregon FarmLink called the Navigate program. So if you are a farmland seeker and you are looking for some one-on-one help and subsidized legal expertise from some of our partners and just general land seeker assistance, please do check out the Navigate program. They are currently accepting applications for both their BIPOC and intersectional identities cohort, as well as the South Willamette Valley cohort. So if you are looking for farmland, head on over to OregonFarmLink.org and check out the Navigate program. We also run the Oregon Pasture Network, which is relevant to this topic right here. That is a community of practice for pasture-based livestock producers across the state. So with a focus on, and we have our OPN manager, Courtney Stone, on the call today. If anyone has questions directly about OPN, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them. And that is a community of practice which has just about 92 members currently, representing about 10,000 acres in production across the state. And if you are an eater of better meat, you can head on over to OregonPastureNetwork.org, search through the pastured product guide, and find a producer near you to purchase pasture-based rotational grazing style meat that will align with your community, ecosystem, and animal values. We also have mentorship programs for folks looking to get into that work, as well as the Oregon Pasture Education Network over there if you are just a land manager who wants to manage your pastures better for climate resilience. So that's Oregon Pasture Network. And the reason that we're all here today is because of our advocacy program. Since we were founded in 2005, FoFF has had a systems change approach to food system work. We have been involved with local regulatory and legislative work across the state. We work extensively with ODA on the implementation and of legislation and regulation of farms in general. And we work in a legislative arena to make changes that are directed by our farmers on our Oregon legislative calendar. So every 2 years, we ask our members across the state what they care most about and what they want us to work on. And when we asked that in 2022, the industrialization of the food system and concerns thereof was in the top 5, as it has been since our founding. So we have been part of this group working together to make change and push Oregon away from a factory farm system since our inception. And we're very happy to talk with you today about what happened in 2023 and what SB 85 really means. But before we get into that, I want to introduce my co-presenter, Amy Van Son of the Center for Food Safety, who has been a pivotal partner in the Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition, of which we are both members. And Amy, would you like to introduce your organization and what CFS does?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Welcome, folks. Amy Van Son. I'm a senior attorney with Center for Food Safety, so I'm on our legal team, responsible for a lot of our impact litigation, much of which is nationwide in scope, but some of which is specific here to the Pacific Northwest, where I'm in our Oregon office. And I also have the privilege of working on some policy issues and legislative work, and that is mainly on factory farming and largely through the Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition. And so Center for Food Safety, here I'll actually just put our link in the chat for anyone who has not been to our website. Our mission is generally to dismantle the industrial food system and replace it with something that's actually healthy for people and for the planet. And we do that through high impact litigation. Our legal team is like a big portion of our staff, as well as through public education, regulatory, legislative advocacy, basically every tool in the tool belt that one might have, other than a lot of on the ground organizing. So we tend to come in and try to help with legal expertise or policy expertise and support organizations that are made up of community members or who do a lot of organizing. That's why we work in coalition very frequently. And and I've been the manager of the Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition for, I believe, its whole 5-year official since we officially launched. So I was really proud to see that we passed something this past session, despite walkout of many of the senators. And you know, we'll get into this, but it's certainly not everything we wanted. Far from it, but I think it's already having some good impacts. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer any more questions about like what it is I do or what it is Center for Food Safety does, if those come up. Alice, do you want me to just dive into SB 85, or do you want to talk about the other legislation first?
I think that I wanted to give a little bit of background about the Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition. I apologize. I was in the process of making us a very wonderful slide deck, and then my power went out for about 3 hours this morning. So
Oh
yeah,
no.
things happen.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that too. The coalition
Yeah,
background.
how we came to be and kind of some of the background of this issue in the States, probably starting with the 2008 Dairy Air Quality Task Force and kind of bringing us up to why we are where we are.
Yeah. Sorry, I know you told me to do that and I blanked. It's a Monday. I'm feeling very Monday today. Yeah, so I guess, oh, well, yeah, if we want to start with back with like 2008. So obviously, as you know, Oregon is a dairy state. We have lots of dairy here. But much like the rest of the country, we've seen a lot of consolidation of dairy, like other factory, like, I'm sorry, like other animal agriculture into these larger factory type settings, as opposed to having animals on land and being pastured. And some of that, we kind of, a lot of it was kicked off, I guess I would say, when 3 Mile Canyon Farms opened up in 2001. This was the biggest dairy in the state. They are permitted now for up to 90,000 cows, I believe. I don't think they have that many, but at the moment, but they are permitted to be quite large. Of course, the federal definition of a large concentrated animal feeding operation is 700 cows. So, we're talking, of course, orders of magnitude larger than that. And when they opened up to supply Tillamook Creamery, folks were rightly concerned about what kind of impacts there would be from concentrating that much waste in one place. And these are air quality impacts in terms of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, other types of air emissions that have, and methane that have impacts on both health and on the climate. As well as just that much waste being collected in a lagoon system and then sprayed onto land, what that might do to the groundwater and to surface waters. And in 2008, they did get, that was when the recommendations happened, but folks went to, including one of the founders of FoFF, went to the legislature and said, we need to deal with these really huge operations because the laws that we have that apply to somebody with, say, 50 head of cattle should not be the same for those that have so many more than that, orders of magnitude larger. And there was a major concern about ammonia and other these air emissions coming from 3 Mile Canyon and how they impact the gorge. There was acid rain issues that mixed with what used to be the Boardman coal plant and their emissions, causing a lot of problems there, as well as the climate impacts, and methane being a really powerful greenhouse gas. And of course, a lot of times when you go to Salem, you want to build, they give you just a lousy work group. But that's what they got. They got a work group, and it was called the Dairy Task Force, the Dairy Air Quality Task Force. Kendra, who I was speaking about before, Kimbrasis served on that, and it brought together both farmers, advocates, and people in the industry that are operating these larger facilities. And they came up with a whole series of recommendations in 2008 that would have the Department of Environmental Quality that does air permitting for other businesses that have air emissions of different kinds that could affect health or the environment. And it said, here's the measures we should have. And it talked about starting with voluntary and going into mandatory air, controls, things you can do to deal with the air emissions. That was never put into law. We did try several years ago to get that funded and get that program up and running, but it still hasn't happened. And then Stand Up to Factory Farms as a coalition came together more formally when Lost Valley Mega Dairy was proposed to open up just really down the road from 3 Mile Canyon Farms. So this is already an area that is designated as a groundwater management area, meaning that it already has existing contamination with high levels of nitrates. And nitrates, of course, are unhealthy for us in high amounts. They cause all sorts of problems from, you may have heard blue baby syndrome, because that having a lot of nitrates, it affects your blood's ability to carry oxygen. And then it has a lot of long-term impacts that aren't immediately noticeable. Things like cancers, reproductive harm, things that, they're insidious, like they develop over time. And nitrates in drinking water are flavorless, odorless, and clear. You have no idea if you have high levels of nitrates without doing testing. So we were very concerned that there would be another huge source, 30,000 cow dairy right in the same area. And so there was groups coming together like Center for Food Safety, Food and Water Watch, that are more national in scope, and then Friends of Family Farmers, Friends of the Gorge, Columbia Riverkeeper, groups that, and I'd say Columbia Riverkeeper and Friends of the Gorge, who care about that area. They care about the river and the gorge, and it's the ability of those ecosystems to function and provide a place for people to recreate and to have their livelihoods. All of that, who had not previously worked much on farming or factory farms, but it was a wide group of folks who came together, as well as some groups that concerned about the welfare of animals and these types of operations. That said, to the state, we did all this commenting, and we raised awareness so that there were over 4,000 people in the state commented to ODA to say, don't permit this operation. It's too big. It's in the wrong place. And ODA basically said, well, we don't have any power to say no. They wrote an individual permit. And they said, this is like the Cadillac of permits. This is the best permit ever written. The groundwater will be protected. Everything's fine. Now, of course, there's no air quality controls because that still doesn't exist. But they issued this permit. And of course, you probably know the story of Lost Valley. They immediately started violating their permit because a permit's only as good as if it is followed. And they racked up over 200 violations of this water quality permit before ultimately, finally being shut down. And in that time, we launched our Stand Up to Factory Farms campaign, looking for a moratorium on new dairies specifically is what we started as, because dairy was the big issue that we were seeing, while the state figured out how to deal with this kind of operation, what laws and policies need to be changed and regulations need to be written to make sure that there's actually protections. And we pushed and pressured the state to shut down Lost Valley, which they eventually did. And so that's how we started up. And then we last year opened up our goals, and we noticed we named ourselves Stand Up to Factory Farms, specifically not Stand Up to Mega Dairies, because a lot of our groups know that other operations that grow chickens or hogs also have a lot of problems. So just because dairy was the immediate threat we saw, we wanted to leave it open. And then, of course, we did wind up running our moratorium bill this past session to include any of the largest tier of what we call factory farming, which means confined and concentrated. So lots of animals, no pasture. And we did that, of course, because of the threat of the Foster Farms expansion in the Willamette Valley, because so many of our members in these different groups were saying, this is a big problem, we need to stop this. So I guess that leads us up to the current session, and so I'll pause there.
Yeah, and I do want to take time to acknowledge the really large role that local coalition in SIO played in this past session. And they organized under a temporary kind of banner called Friends or Farmers Against Foster Farms, so FAFF. And they I think that maybe some folks are, yeah, Tim is on the call right now. And I wanted to acknowledge that the local coalition there has a huge hand to play in the success that we experienced in the legislature this year. And they are, they're one of the biggest reasons that we expanded this moratorium campaign, because we saw that this was not a one-off effort. This was an intentional targeting from a multinational company who saw Oregon as an opportunity to come in and was seeking permits for lots of facilities all at once in the Willamette Valley on some of the best farmland in the country. And so we're really, really grateful for our partners in SIO and all of the work that they put in to be at the hearings and to push this issue forward. I did want to take one moment to kind of define what we consider a factory farm and what we do not consider a factory farm, because I think this is an issue, a point of contention that some folks in our opposition have really muddied the waters on. And I want to be clear that lots of the people that I represent hold small and medium CAFO permits. There are a lot of reasons why you might have a CAFO permit. Maybe you have a processing facility on site. Maybe you have a sacrifice area or have a manure system that requires you to do that. But when you are in a small or medium scale, you are under a state permit. There are two types of permits that we call CAFO permits here in the state. There's confined animal feeding operation, and then there's concentrated animal feeding operation. So confined animal feeding operation is a state-run permit, which we are all for water quality, and we know that every farmer in the state does not want to be polluting the water that they rely on and that their communities rely on. So the confined animal feeding operation permit is operated by ODA and is theirs to govern. The concentrated animal feeding operation permit is when you get into Clean Water Act territory. So when you are a larger facility that requires compliance with the Clean Water Act and federal legislation, then you get into that concentrated animal feeding operation, and that becomes a federal permit. So when we talk about large tier 2 CAFO permits, we're talking about those concentrated animal feeding operations. Large tier 2 is the largest type of permit that you can get. As Amy said, on the federal level, large, here in Oregon, we have large tier 1 and large tier 2. Large tier 1, for example, for a dairy is 700 cows and up to 2,500 cows. 2,500 cows and above, there's no upper limit there. That's large tier 2. And when we're talking about chickens, for example, large tier 2 with a dry waste system is 350,000 birds and above at any given time. So these are the largest of the large facilities, and those are the ones that we are seeking to better regulate, because FoFF has always been of the opinion that small farms and large farms have to be regulated differently because of the risk that they pose to the environment and the communities around them. You cannot build a system for large farms and, for large farms and then impose it onto small farms. And a system built for small farms will not be adequate to regulate a farm of that scale. So we have to address things by the level of risk that they pose, which is why we at the Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition have always been focusing on the largest of the large, and why many of the provisions in SB 85 are focused on those large operations. So just wanted to give a little background about what is a factory farm, because I know that term does not have a legal definition. So we want to be clear about who we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's we started using the term mega dairy when referring to dairies of a size of 2,500 or more cows, and then mega chicken. I think because it really it's supposed to explain like this is a really large operation. And I just want to clarify in terms of Clean Water Act, federal permitting versus state. If you're impacting surface water and it's a water of the United States, which is you may have heard some of the much controversy over how that is defined, and especially with regard to wetlands. But that's where the federal jurisdiction comes in, is whether if there's a water of the US, which is anything that's a traditionally navigable water is obvious. So like the North Santiam River is a water of the US. And so and then the state regulates groundwater. And so if there's a operation that's affecting maybe just groundwater, but maybe not surface water, there is a state only permit that doesn't involve the federal law of the Clean Water Act. And so some of that matters in terms of the what we're going to talk about, I think, with the bill in terms of groundwater versus surface water, but also, for example, the dry waste. And I don't really even like calling it dry because like if you're in a really wet area, is it really dry? But the not using the lagoon, not using water to wash out barns and holding it in large lagoons that are, you know, of a liquid nature. So that the chicken, so when we're talking about chicken, a lot of that is going to have more of an impact potentially on groundwater or yeah. But anyway, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but just a note on the law there.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, and I think that I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of like what happened during the session, because I know that what we started with was very different than what we ended with SB 85. And then I know that Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition, we've all been working on a pretty clear and although slightly wonky, but probably applicable to the folks on this call, simplified
An explainer, yeah.
Explainer.
I have it queued up.
Pager,
I
but
was
it is
gonna
page.
I was gonna share it while we talk about like the actual like what the bill does. But yeah, and then we are trying to like de-wonkify that a little bit to have it be more simple. But yeah, I think for folks that are on this call, you might actually want to know like the details of what this bill will do. So
yeah.
Go ahead, Alice.
So in SB 85, I know many of you were with us for the entirety of this campaign and you saw how different it got. In the beginning, we were asking for a moratorium. And what that means is a pause on permitting. We were asking for a moratorium on any large tier 2 permits. And the largest stretch of time that was ever put in writing, I believe, was 8 years in one of the drafts that we saw for SB 85. And that moratorium was supposed to kick off a period of discussion and policy creation so that we could, during that 8-year pause, develop regulations that would actually protect our groundwater, our communities, small farms, and the air and all of the natural resources and community assets involved from the impacts of poorly regulated industrial agriculture. So we were hoping to have that level, that time frame in order to have those thoughtful discussions, to come to the table with everyone involved and to make like do any research that was needed or all of those things. But we were quickly told that moratorium had become a 4-letter word in Salem and that moratorium was not an option for us. So instead of having that 8-year period to develop really solid, like thoughtful policy, we had to draw on the brain trust that we had created and put forward a proposal of every regulation that we thought would help based on what we know right now. So
how to solve CAFOs in 3 days.
Yeah, I think we were given what, like 7 working days, maybe 10, to figure that out. So about 2 weeks to do what we hope to do in 8 years. But I think we had tons of folks at the table, lots of different stakeholders from different parts of the issue, local communities, scientists, everything that we could think of. And we put together a gigantic package of what we thought would protect our communities and our ecosystems and be a viable path forward. Then, of course, we entered into the space of legislative negotiations. And during this time, there was a hearing, there was an informational hearing in February. So grateful to everyone involved who came to that. The room was packed. Then there was a first public hearing, I believe in March, when we were still discussing a moratorium. That hearing was again packed. Then when we had the first round of regulatory edits, I believe that was called the -3 amendment, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly. We had another hearing, and again, that was packed. And then we had a third, and this was all in the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And then there was an additional public hearing in the Senate Rules Committee where this bill ended up going. And again, packed. I think that there were folks that we had recruited to come say their piece and testify in every one of those hearings who did not get to speak because they ran out of time. And we are so eternally grateful for everyone who sat through those hearings and was not allowed to speak, and for those who were able to stand up and say their piece. Overall, there were dozens and dozens of folks who testified orally, and 643 pieces of written testimony were submitted in support of these efforts. So that is a historic number of pieces of testimony across all of these different iterations of the bill to show support for stricter factory farm regulations here in Oregon. And at the end of the day, we were, even with the walkouts, even with all the delay tactics, even with everything associated with it, we were able to pass a version of SB 85 that is much, much smaller and more limited than we ever wanted it to be, and does not represent a complete solution in any way, shape, or form, but is still a historic piece of legislation in terms of the first limitation on industrial agriculture legally in over a decade that I am aware of. So with that said, and kind of the saga of how we got from A to B, I'd like to hand it back over to Amy, and you can pop that document in the chat and we can go through it together to talk through what SB 85 really means. Oh, screen sharing, even better.
Yes. I thought that would be easier for folks to look at this. So yeah, as Alice said, we started with a moratorium and we ended up with SB 85 as it is written here. But I do want to note that the two properties that were proposed to be mega chicken facilities are up for sale: the Evergreen Ranch and the High Day Ranch. I love that they use the name ranch, because I don't know how much of a ranch it is when all your chickens live inside a building all the time. But I think that it's pretty fair to say that this legislation is a big reason why those operations are choosing not to try to open. So what the bill does, mainly what it has three kind of big areas. It's water quality permitting, which is currently the main permit that any CAFO operation has to get, right? Including the mega sized ones. And then water quantity, so how much water you can use. And so the first thing it does is it limits ODA to issuing only individual permits instead of a general permit if you're in a groundwater management area and you are a new large operation. And so we talked about a groundwater management area. Those are designated when the groundwater is contaminated with something like nitrates, and I think there are several of them. The main one that we are concerned with is the Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area, or LUBGWAMA for short. This is where 3 Mile Canyon and the Easter Day Ranch was proposed to reopen Lost Valley. Of course, they're now selling that operation as well, which is great news. And so this just says that you have to have an individual permit, which is more tailored to the operation, versus signing on to the general permit that has the same general conditions for everyone. And that's great, although I will say Lost Valley also was given an individual permit, and that did not stop it from being problematic. So that's one piece. And then it codifies and makes more robust the multi-step permitting process that ODA was already using. So this goes into effect immediately for large new operations. And so it requires them to have a preliminary consultation with these various agencies, ODA, DEQ, the Water Resources Department, and any other relevant agencies that the state decides, and then notice given to federally recognized Indian tribes. They have to submit a water plan that is reviewed by OWRD to show that there's a legally authorized sufficient water, that you have a water right or other way, means of having enough water for the operation that includes watering the animals themselves, doing any cleaning, any kind of processing, irrigation, all that stuff that you need to make sure that there's enough water for. And my understanding is that they want to avoid what was happening at Lost Valley, where they were trucking in water, because that is not a very sustainable way to do it. So they would that would be a problem if that was in the water plan. And then there will be notice of public comment on these operations to all property owners within 1/2 mile of a new proposed large CAFO. And an ODA has to sign off on the construction before it is populated with livestock. They have already been doing that, but again, this codifies that into the law. And then for renewing new CAFOs of other sizes, so not large, and then anyone renewing that's an existing operation, they will have to submit the water supply plan. And again, ODA will have to sign off on the construction before it's populated with livestock. And both of those things are really in response to the Lost Valley debacle, because it was built before it was permitted. The state elected not to do anything about that. And it turns out it was built improperly. And so there were infrastructure problems that were causing or contributing to, as well as mismanagement, but contributing to some of these permit violations. And then they also didn't have adequate water. They wanted to do a water transfer. It was protested both by some of our groups in Stand Up to Factory Farms, as well as by another local farm in terms of the impacts to their water. And so the owner, Greg Tveld, was just trucking in water and then didn't have sufficient water to clean out the barns or to have working bathrooms for his employees. So it was really a problem. And so these two things are addressing that. So that's the water quality piece. The water quantity piece is this temporary limit on the stock water exemption. And so the stock water exemption says, unlike any other kind of water right, if you are using water to water your livestock for drinking water, then you can use an unlimited amount no matter where you are and without a permit or a water right. This limits that and caps it to 12,000 gallons per day for all sizes of new operations. And it limits it for 5 years. So it sunsets in 5 years. The idea behind the sunset is, of course, we wanted it to be more permanently limited, but it was like, okay, well, let's give this 5-year pause and help to our water, our fresh water resources, and come up with a more permanent solution in 5 years. And so that one is a pretty big one, something that one of our member groups, Water Watch of Oregon, has been pushing for a long time. They've run it as an independent bill in the past, just because, especially when you're in a critical groundwater area, other farms rely on that water, as as do wildlife, and people for drinking water. So, the idea that, this exemption was written years and years and years ago, when it was like, sure, you're ranching 50 or 100 cattle is very different than 70,000 cows needing drinking water and needing water for cleaning and all that. So it just is, it's a different world now that we're in. So there's that part. And it actually gives the Water Resources Department the authority to recommend that ODA and DEQ condition their permits on requiring water use metering for new or expanding production areas, keeping records of how much water is used, and or prohibiting an expanding CAFO within a critical groundwater area from using more than that cap of 12,000 gallons a day. So again, this is a recommendation that the Water Resources Department would make. It doesn't mean that ODA would necessarily do it, take that recommendation, but it's saying, if you're in an area where there's already low resources of water, that maybe we shouldn't be citing there. And then another water quality aspect here is ODA is creating a new set of rules, a new permit for nutrient application. This will only apply to third parties, so not the CAFO itself, but if they export their waste in whatever form to another person, another farmer, or whomever who's spreading this waste, if they're within one of those groundwater management areas, So already contaminated area, they have to get this permit before they spread the waste. And this is to deal with the problem of, the CAFO itself has a permit that would say, how much waste you should be spreading. Basically, it's ideally to only spread an agronomically useful amount and not have the rest of it be going down into groundwater or running off into surface water. But that only regulates the CAFO itself and not anyone who they export their waste to. So this is trying to get at that problem of, if you're spreading that waste, well, we also want to make sure you're doing it in an agronomic way and not over applying it, especially where the groundwater is already contaminated. And again, we wanted that to apply statewide to protect the places that aren't already over contaminated from being contaminated, especially because we were seeing with these Foster Farms operations, there was going to be 100% export of all that chicken litter. And so where is that going to go? Who's going to be applying that? And that was a big issue. Now, unfortunately, this won't apply to that. But I know we've got some great people that are going to be hopefully serving on the Rules Advisory Committee for this new rulemaking, because this actually has to go through the rulemaking process before this permit will be available and required, unlike the other stuff I just talked about that is going into effect immediately. And then beyond the groundwater quality and quantity, the last thing it does is it gives authority to, but does not require local governments to require setbacks for these for CAFO operations from residential structures or non-conforming but allowable, basically saying structures like schools or other kind of social gathering areas that are not farm related but are on farm land but are from before the farm use regulations went into place. Basically, our land, I'm sure a lot of you know this, our land use system is very top down. So local governments like Lynn County, for example, couldn't say, said like, we would love to put some more requirements around this operation, but we're not allowed to do that. We basically rubber stamp, yes, it's a farm operation in a exclusive farm use zone, and that's it. So this does open that up a little bit, which is a great step, I think, but certainly doesn't go as far as it could. And then, so one big thing to note here, a new CAFO is only one that is trying to operate on a parcel of land where no CAFO has previously operated. So JS Ranch would be an example of that, but reopening Lost Valley, like the Easterday family tried to do, that would not actually count as new because there's previously a CAFO on that spot. So the devil's always in the details with these things, and that's a really important piece to note. And then expanding is if you're expanding into a new tier. So if you're going from medium to large or large tier 1 to large tier 2, that would count as expanding. If you are already in the largest of the large, it's 20%. So if you're going over 20% of your current capacity, and that's quite a lot when you're talking about an operation that's already 70 or 90,000 cows large. That 20% of that is a huge number, and that still wouldn't even be defined as expanding under this law. And so small and medium operations are largely not impacted. They do have to do the water supply plan for permit renewals and would be limited if it's a new operation coming online on a piece of land that's never seen a CAFO before. Then they would be limited by the stockwater exemption. But when you're talking about lower number of animals, 12,000 gallons a day could certainly be sufficient. And so just to highlight again when this takes effect. So for new or expanding operations, many of the provisions take effect immediately. We have until July of next year for large operations, that's tier 1 and tier 2 large, that are renewing their permits. And then July of 2025 for smaller medium operations renewing their permits. So not only are small and medium operations not that affected, they also have a much larger lead up time to having to do the water supply plan and being under the stock water limit. And again, the nutrient application permit is a new permit, so ODA has to write the rules first, and that can take a long time, and there's no deadline in the bill, in the law that requires it. So who knows when that will be? Hopefully sooner rather than later. And then what does this leave out? Well, it's not a moratorium. While it hopefully will stop some operations that shouldn't be in the places that they want to site or who would use too much water, this still is shifted to a regulatory approach versus giving us time to actually consider like what needs to be reformed, what needs to be financed for the agencies that have this authority. There's no climate and air pollution controls in this bill. It does require DEQ to report to the legislature within 6 months of EPA finishing its air emissions study and guidelines on how to estimate air emissions. For the last 15 or so years, EPA has given amnesty to the livestock industry in terms of the Clean Air Act and compliance with that, with some small exceptions. But we've been waiting a very long time for EPA to finish this study and to actually start enforcing the Clean Air Act. And that wouldn't include methane, but DEQ does currently have authority to deal with air emissions from CAFOs, from dairy specifically. You know, again, the dairy air task force went into detail about how they should do that. So this sort of is like a first step into getting air pollution and climate pollution controls, but does not go very far. There are no protections for wildlife beyond what we already have. There was once in the bill a setback from fish-bearing streams that was ultimately taken out, and nothing on animal welfare. Many of our groups are very concerned about, the life of an animal that's kept inside its whole life, and the industry, the trade groups, the Farm Bureau and Cattlemen's and Dairy Association were very angry at the idea that their farmers don't treat their animals well. So, really we just wanted to have a work group to just look at the issue, assure people, yeah, if it's true that those animals are doing fine, then nothing to hide. But that was stripped out as well. And yeah, so I'll just wrap up by saying, like, this is the first big change to happen in decades in Oregon or really any other state, that this segment of the livestock industry, what we would again call factory farming, is uh, let go, left alone more than any other industry. Contrary to what we hear, is that this is such a highly regulated field. Well, compared to other industry, it certainly is not. So getting something on the books is certainly better than nothing. And yeah, so I'll wrap it up there. And Alice, if you want to take us away on other bills, or I'm happy to take questions too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that we are coming to the point of our presentation where we are open to taking questions and making sure that everybody on the call, has an opportunity to wade through this together with us. As Amy said, the rulemaking process on this bill has not been completed yet, so this is not technically in effect as of now. Myself and some of the other members of organizations involved in this campaign have requested to be on that rulemaking advisory committee with the ODA. So we are keeping a very close eye on how this bill gets implemented so that we can make sure that if there are loopholes created or misunderstandings about the intent of the bill, that we are there to try to ensure that this legislation is implemented the way that it was intended to protect the groups that we've been talking about today. So with that, I think that we would like to open it up to anybody who has questions or any requests for other information.